Well, good evening and welcome everyone. I hope you can all hear me. Please put your hands up if you can't. So welcome everyone to the Sheldon Lecture, the first of two we're holding in 2025. They're presented by the Sheldon Memorial Trust as part of a continuing and happy association with the University of York's Open Lecture Programme, whose organisers we gratefully thank. We just saw Naomi Richards, who is our main point of contact, and we're very grateful to her for her continuing and unfailing support. Now, we're really delighted to have in our audience this evening about 10 members of the family of Noel Terry, the subject of this evening's York. So special welcome to all of you if you're members of that family. Firstly, a couple of practical notes. One is the usual reminder, please, for telephones to be silenced. Secondly, and with great pleasure, we invite you all to join us for a glass of wine after the talk and question time, and the wine and soft drinks will be served immediately outside the lecture theatre. It's also a pleasant duty to remind ourselves about the man memorialised by the Sheldon Trust. The lectures arranged by the Trust honour the memory of Oliver Sheldon, a director of Rowntree's, who in the middle years of the last century played a crucial role in the founding or development of cultural institutions in York, notably the York Georgian Society and the York Civic Trust. But probably most importantly, he was instrumental in laying the ground for what was ultimately to become the University of York. Sadly, he never saw the university, for it was not to open until 12 years after his sadly early death at the age of 57 in 1951. However, it's that university where we are meeting today. This evening's lecture is, I think, the 18th in the current series, launched in 2008. Their biographical subjects being figures who have contributed significantly to the cultural, intellectual, or economic life of York, mostly in the 20th century. Appropriately, the first subject was Oliver Sheldon himself, and it's interesting to note that Noel Terry, the subject of the present talk, was a founding member of the management committee of the Trust, set up in Sheldon's name in 1953. Our speaker this evening, Stan Young, will explore the life, achievements and legacy of a man who played an exceptional role in local industry, heading a firm of chocolatiers of international repute. Stan has been thoroughly immersed as a volunteer in various projects concerned with the history of the chocolate industry in York. These have included oral history work relating to both Terry's and, dare I say it, Rowntree's, and the continuing development of a database devoted to the content of the Rowntree Works, Cocoa Works magazine. He has written information panels for the recently restored Terry Clock Tower, now occasionally open to the public, and carried out initial research on the Terry cocoa plantations in Venezuela. We had long been seeking a speaker on Noel Terry, and were delighted when Stan Young finally came onto our radar, and moreover agreed to take on this particular task. Please would you join me in welcoming him this evening.
Thank you very much. I hope you can all hear me. I'm getting nods, so I think you can. If by any chance I start speaking too quickly later on, please let me know, because I am a bit concerned about my timing. So I'll do my best. I'd particularly like to welcome, as indeed Richard has, several members of the Terry family who are with us tonight. And I'd also like to welcome the granddaughter of the botanist to the plantations, Mrs. Kathleen Harrison, who I hope is able to be with us tonight, and who we will talk about a bit later on. But I'm very glad that you're all here and that there is such a good audience. Thank you. So Here is a brief visual introduction to the 20th century members of the Noel Terry and his family. And we'll obviously be talking about most of these people as the next hour proceeds. As a volunteer at Goddard's, the family home of the Terry family, one of the most frequent things said by visitors is that they had travelled up and down the Tadcaster Road many times, looking for Goddard's, but had difficulty finding it. The gatehouse you see here is, in the context of a busy road, fairly inconspicuous. It's set back from the road and looks similar to an ordinary house, with no clue to the well-hidden family home behind it. Whilst that is partly due to the style of architecture which Walter Brierley developed, an analogy can be drawn between the easily missed, low-key, understated style of that gatehouse with the character of Noel Terry. Noel contributed a huge amount to York, but not always in a way that was easily traceable. One of the difficulties in putting this talk together has been the almost total lack of direct first-hand material of a personal nature left by our subject, with the exception of his correspondence to his girlfriend and wife-to-be, Kathleen Leatham, and a recorded interview he gave to his great friend, John Shannon, in the 1970s. Noel left a significant legacy to the city of York through his role in many organisations, his clock and furniture collection, his relationships with people, and the company he led for many years, but he left no known diaries or memoirs. So it has been necessary to piece together the life of this enigmatic man in order that we can mark his contribution to the city. This talk was conceived, as Richard has referred to, by the Oliver Sheldon Memorial Trust, because Noel was one of 5 men who worked together over many years and shared a deep love of York. The other 4 men were John Bowes Morell, Oliver Sheldon himself, John Shannon, and Dean Milner White of York Minster. These men were working together and separately over several years, and more is known about them than Noel. Together and separately, they contributed to the formation of the York Civic Trust, the Georgian Society, and to the work of Fairfax House, Merchant Adventurers, and many other organisations. So tonight, the intention is to balance things a little and focus on Noel Terry. By the way, it does seem a coincidence that tonight's event is in memory of Oliver Sheldon, as it was at Oliver's house that Noel's eldest son, Peter, met his wife for the first time. This evening is unnerving for me, as I know there will be people in this audience who know a great deal about and perhaps knew Noel Terry or his circle. I hope that they will recognise most of what I say and may be able to contribute at the end. In preparing this, I have sometimes had different answers to the same question, such as social and perhaps family history. All the members of the Terry family I have met or communicated with have given their time and shared so much very willingly. In particular, Noel's granddaughter, Mrs. Jean Kuipers, whose mother, Betty, was Noel's only daughter. Jean has generously shared a great deal of material, many photographs, memories of her grandfather, and her visits to Goddard's, and given me so much time and encouragement over the last few years. I will, of course, list everyone at the end, as their support and interest has been essential. The staff at the Borthwick Institute at the University of York have been very helpful in accessing lots of archives, and is where the Terry archive is now being worked on. And I'm told that the company archive is almost complete, but the work on the family archive is about to begin when funding can be established for that work. However, I plead forgiveness if I get anything wrong or leave out any important aspect. The fault will be mine. I hope that if Mr. Terry were with us tonight, he would forgive me addressing him as Noel. He was known to be incensed if anyone referred to him by his first name, unless they were very close friends. But somehow using his first name seems more appropriate in this setting, and I suspect many of us are his friends. Now, our lives do not easily fall into compartments, but we have very limited time tonight. In fact, I haven't got my watch off. So I will focus on these areas: the Terry and Leatham families and the secret diaries, Noel's military career in both wars, Noel's home and family life, his life in the company, his civic life in York, and then bring things together, hopefully, with a kind of summary of perhaps who Noel Terry really was and what legacy he has left us for the future. So this is Noel Terry, born in 1889 and who died in 1980. He had two brothers, Harold and Neville, and two sisters, Frances and Betsy. His father, Thomas, worked for the Terry Company, but died in 1910, aged 55, when Noel was just 20 years old. Unfortunately, so far, we have been unable to find a photograph of Noel's father clear enough to be shown here. Noel's mother was Sarah Maria, but known as Mia, Brett, the only daughter of Mr. E.P. Brett, the founder of the York brewery, Brett Brothers, in Spurriergate. They came from Nottinghamshire, hence the name of the family home on the Mount, Trent Home, which was and still is opposite what is now the Elmbank Hotel, but in those days was the home of Ernest Leatham's brother, Sidney. That was Kathleen's uncle, and we'll hear more about him later. The romance between Noel and Kathleen started in 1910, when Kathleen was 17 and Noel was 20. They did not part again until they died within 3 months of each other at Goddard's in 1980. Kathleen first, then Noel. Kathleen was the third and youngest daughter of Henry Ernest Leatham and his wife, Mary Hannah, known as Minnie Cunning, and they lived at Alderside, a Victorian mansion designed by the architect A.J. Penty for Ernest Leatham in 1895 and 6. The house is now in apartments, but the large gardens and lakes have since been built on. Noel's home at Trent Home on the Mount was less than 2 miles away. Both came from leading industrial families, but in 1910 the Leatham flour mills on the banks of the Ouse, owned by the Leatham family, were prospering. Joseph Terry and Sons were not. Noel and Kathleen's relationship was fiercely opposed by her parents, and so letter writing was an essential activity. Noel's daughter, Betty, wrote a remarkable book entitled Secret Letters, in which she traced the themes, events, issues and sentiments expressed by Noel and Kathleen between 1910 and 1916 in their letters. I have spent some considerable time exploring the original letters. Many are still tied in neat bundles and getting fragile, so it is difficult to use them as a primary source. In their totality, they are a unique example of social history, recording real life at that time, as well as an example of the art of letter writing, which we seem to be losing. Secret Letters gives us a rare glimpse of Kathleen and Noel's feelings for each other, in particular the young Noel's ability to express his warm, humorous and perceptive personality. Judging by comments made by Noel's mother in September 1910, when he told her that Mr. and Mrs. Leatham had become aware of his affection for Kathleen, it was apparent that the two families already had connections. Noel's mother commented that this was a critical time when everything at Terry's depended so much on what Mr. Leatham would do to help them all, seeming to imply that he must not be upset. Not long after that, Kathleen overheard her father speaking to Noel's brother, Harold, who would soon marry Kathleen's older sister, Constance. What was said was not recorded, but it led Kathleen to write to Noel saying, "I shouldn't like him always to have his finger in our pie. He is an excellent businessman, and he might improve things there, but at what cost to other people?" It seems that Terrys were already dependent on Leatham goodwill and finance in relation to the business. Ernest was apparently unsure about Noel's motives for being interested in his daughter, while also feeling that at 17, Kathleen was too young to commit to a serious relationship. This did not discourage Noel and Kathleen one bit. The letters show that they were totally devoted to each other. Many letters show great openness about their feelings, their views of family life, and all express great love for each other. In 1911, Ernest met formally with Noel and told him very firmly that there was to be no contact between him and Kathleen. This did not end the relationship or contact. In October 1912, Noel wrote to Kathleen, expressing his view that she was the only person who truly understood him. "It's always you I want to come to. I wake up and realise that there are such things as fathers, family objections, and money. Oh, dearest heart, you're dearer to me than all the gold in the world. And if there is anything definite against me, apart from the stock I spring from, and of which I am certainly not ashamed, if there was even any social difference, I could understand it better." They endured tremendous hardship in trying to meet, hence the importance of the letters, thought to be at least 400 in number, although in her book, Betty states that there were some 800 letters. As can be seen here, even counting them will be a long job. Many that I have seen and read are very thoughtful, expressing strong feelings, positive and negative, about aspects of family life and relatives. Some are quite philosophical, deeply thoughtful about their own futures, and some too private to share here. Many others are humorous and simple updates on daily life, but all that I have seen are from the pens of two very articulate and mature people for their age. Sadly, some of Kathleen's to Noel no longer exist, as he indicates in one letter from the front in 1916 that he had to burn some as he couldn't carry them all. Whatever very large number do still exist, they are important and useful as social history, and now, thanks to the generosity of the Terry family, safely at the Borthwick Institute. The Leathams went to great trouble to discourage the relationship. This included sending Kathleen to France to complete her education and then to help her ex-governess run a small school in Surrey. But the strength of Kathleen and Noel's affection for each other survived all these hurdles. Ernest Leatham, that's Kathleen's father, became Sheriff of York 1912 to 13, and this meant that his family would have access to a wide social circle, which he seemed to hope might give Kathleen greater opportunities to meet someone who, in the opinion of her parents, would be of her own standing. An example of the degree of scrutiny they felt they were under is shown in this observation by Betty in an extract from Secret Letters. Back home, though, Kits was one of Noel's favourite names for Kathleen, and they had names for each other through the years, and at one point Noel was actually known as John. Back home, though, Kits could post letters to him. Noel had to rely on Constance, that was Kathleen's older sister, Harold, that was Noel's brother, or Collis, who I think was a cousin but certainly a friend, to act as postman. Kits even got into trouble from her mother when Noel was found to be at the theatre on the same night as the Leatham family, and she had to admit that she did know because she had phoned him. Her mother told her this was not to happen again. Kathleen felt that her relations, particularly Uncle Sidney, her father's brother, at Elmbank, opposite Trentholm, had been briefed to spy on her. Some family members told me that Noel and Constance played tennis at Trentholm, and that notes between Noel and Kathleen and vice versa were often hidden in the hat Constance wore when she arrived and left Trentholm. Constance was a great ally of her younger sister. Despite all this, Mr. Leatham had to accept not one but two Terry family members into his fold, since another of his daughters, Constance, married Noel's older brother, Harold. As they were over the age of consent, he could not prevent that happening. So we'll explore Noel's military career briefly. Noel's war service began in 1915 when training courses organised with training courses organised by the School of Instruction for Officers at Leeds University. His almost 5-year relationship with Kathleen was strong, but still under threat from Kathleen's father, who continued to make life very difficult for them. Eventually, and to cut a long story short, tensions eased between them, and Ernest, now with an increasing role in the Terry Company, could see that Noel was a serious and conscientious worker. He consented to Noel and Kathleen marrying on the 8th of October 1915 at the Church of St Edward the Confessor in Dringhouses. It is said for a place on the board of Joseph Terry and Sons. Many letters show that Kathleen made most of the arrangements at very short notice for this and for the 2-week honeymoon in Cornwall. The secret letters tell us that Noel was appointed second lieutenant in the West Yorkshire Regiment, stationed in York, Leeds and Strensall. Kathleen, a competent photographer who had developed and printed her own films, helped him learn some basic photography so that they could exchange photographs. His training continued in the UK for several months after the marriage, which pleased Kathleen no end, as they could meet occasionally and legitimately. This followed many years of having to either not meet at all or meet in secret at great risk of being discovered. Remember that at one point Kathleen's parents had actually banned the relationship. He served in France, not far from Thiepval, from August 1916, and the letters show a great diversity of his training before taking up duties on the front line. After a journey of 26 hours, he arrived, although he had no idea where. He then found himself in the trenches for several days. This is from one of his letters to Kathleen, dated the 28th of August. I cannot say I'm very enamoured of the life. Our entrance was a particularly unfortunate one. Through some mistake, we were coming into trenches during the evening streff, the word for attack. Gaunt, a colleague, told me that it was the worst experience of entering trenches he had ever had. We have now been moved to a place near the rear, and while I write, there is a great big streff on. We have had 6 shells exploding all around the dugout, which is on the reverse slope. One has filled in the doorway, and the explosions are simply deafening. And then on September the 4th, he sent a particularly distressing letter mentioning the names of people killed or wounded whom Kathleen knew. This included his closest friend, along with a very vivid description of the results of war on individuals too distressing to quote here in this context. Food was very important, so there are frequent references to the joys of treats sent by his step-uncle Frank from the factory, and items sent by the Connings, who owned a grocery shop in Blossom Street, now the home of a very famous chain of grocery shops. At one point, he was appointed battalion bombing officer on the strength of a 4-day course in France. As many of his fellow officers were inexperienced, this entailed great responsibility. He was in charge of the large number of bombs required by the battalions and records making a night patrol into no man's land. At the Battle of the Somme in late November 16, At the Battle of the Somme in late November 1916, he was wounded, receiving a bullet in his thigh. This is the war diary sheet, and the red arrow points to the actual entry, which isn't very easy to read, so I've typed it out separately. Foggy during the morning, wiring in front of the left company was being carried on while the fog lasted. Trenches were being repaired by small parties of the West Yorkshire Regiment, and Second Lieutenant Terry was wounded by machine gun bullet on wiring party. The injury could have been even more serious had it not been for a silver cigarette case he carried in his pocket, and which, with its large jagged hole, he kept as a souvenir for many years. He lay in the open for a lengthy period. The letters report that he was in a great deal of pain and had to be given gas even to get dressed. He was operated on again before being returned to his base, and on December the 11th, 1916, he wrote to Kathleen, who he had dissuaded from trying to join him. The operation was all for the forward movement. They tied the ends of arteries, etc., and finished up sewing up their previous surgical cuts. We have had the lovely experience of being shelled this afternoon. One feels pretty helpless tied by the leg in bed with shells flying about. The nearest threw some dirt on the hut roof. Eventually, he was taken to the Duchess of Westminster Hospital in Le Touquet before his final convalescence in a house in the Mall near to Admiralty Arch. As well as this wound, he suffered a compound fracture to his upper leg. As a result of this, he was unable to bend his right knee and walked with a limp and the aid of a walking stick for some time thereafter. In World War II, Noel was the controller of No. 9 Group of the Royal Observer Corps, based near Lendal in York. He did not take payment for this role. I understand from the Royal Observers Association that the base was in huts close to the river. It was their job to trace and report back to HQ all the movement of aircraft of our enemies. In a recorded interview with John Shannon in 1975, Noel recalled vivid memories of travelling to the Observer Corps one night during the war after a raid. He waded through glass and wreckage in Blossom Street and then saw the Guildhall very close to his base on fire. Noel was awarded the MBE for this service. There is little written about Kathleen's role during this period, but it is known that she was an active member of the WRVS. She worked at the York railway station canteen and assisted in the offices of the Terry Company. Now, both world wars were very difficult and painful times for Noel. The First World War ending the lives of some of his closest friends, including the one who had been best man at his wedding. Noel was left with serious injuries, and the Second World War involving him in very important work in York and resulting in the loss of his son Kenneth. I include some information about Kenneth at this point rather than later when I talk about family life, because Kenneth's tragic death was a part of Noel's and the family's wartime experience. Kenneth was born in 1920 and is described as being quiet, reflective, and extremely clever. He and his sister Betty had a special relationship, spending much time together, playing, visiting airfields, listening to music, reading, and horse riding. From early childhood, Kenneth had always wanted to become a pilot. He succeeded and joined Coastal Command. He made a successful attack on a ship off Norway in November 1941 and was awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross in March 1942, while he was with No. 42 Squadron flying Beauforts. Tragically, he was killed on the 26th of April 1944, when, as squadron leader of No. 547 Squadron, he was flying a Liberator BZ-882 over Cardigan Bay on an exercise. It crashed, killing Kenneth and a crew of 9. As for all the families to whom this happened, life was never the same again at Goddard's or for each member in the family. There is touching and very sensitive evidence of exactly what effect this had on Kathleen and on life at Goddard's. Inevitably, it placed great strains on Noel at the time, as he was needed to support Kathleen through this trauma. In memory of Kenneth, they arranged for a nambo, which is a form of pulpit, to be placed in the minster with an inscription. The ambo is placed just beside the choir stalls, and the inscription is on the front panel just above the backs of the chairs in front. Returning to Noel, we now focus on his home and family life. After just something about these two photographs. The first one is the house that they had lived in after they got married at St George's Place, which was just across the road from Walter Brierly's own family home. And you can see the photograph there of Noel with Betty and Kenneth and Peter. And the photograph on the other side is a very early photograph in Goddard's. They must only have been in a very short time. And you can see Kathleen holding Richard. After the war, his rehabilitation and a brief spell of working in the Ministry of Pensions, Noel returned to family life at St George's Place and continued to make his mark at Terry's during the busy and successful 1920s and 30s. This is Goddard's, the house Noel commissioned from Walter Brierley, the arts and crafts architect who was his neighbour in St George's Place. Within the world of arts and crafts architecture, it is an important house for several reasons, but is now closed to the public and the family rooms are empty. 3 acres of land in Dringhouses were purchased from Colonel Wilkinson. Noel, Kathleen, Peter, Betty and Kenneth moved in 1927. And in case you doubt the year or the ownership, here is the proof. So the initials and then the date of moving in were embedded into the lead drainage pipes. This is the house where Noel read Winnie the Pooh to his children, where Peter told us in an interview that he played cricket illegally on the upstairs landing amidst precious Georgian furniture, where he let the bath overflow while he and his friend Harold finished a game of table tennis, the overflow seeping through to the room below, getting him into serious trouble, where the children performed plays on the upper landing stairs leading to the guest rooms and slept in the garden on some summer nights. And it is from here one Sunday afternoon that, unbeknown to Noel and Kathleen, Kenneth, having just passed his driving test, thought he would try to teach Betty to drive the family Daimler. As they cruised up and down the drive, the car developed a problem. Fortunately, the family chauffeur, who lived in the gatehouse, came to their aid, so Noel and Kathleen knew nothing of this little episode. Governesses of varying quality came and went, as Betty could testify, when she returned home one day with the governess of the time, with a large bruise on her forehead, caused by her having been tipped out of her pram. Richard was born in Goddard's in 1928, and the family is now complete. Kathleen, a strong, capable, perceptive and intelligent woman, managed everything quietly and efficiently with the aid of a cook, housekeeper and maids. More than one relative noted that she seemed to spend most of her time making sure that everything was just right for Noel. However, she did have some life of her own and was active with the YWCA and the Women's Inner Circle. There was a gate at the bottom of the garden, in fact there still is a gate at the bottom of the garden near to the greenhouse, from which Noel would walk across the racecourse each day to his office at the factory directly opposite. After emerging from this gate one morning in the 1940s, he met Mr. George Russell, who had allotments nearby and was famous for developing the lupin flower. He asked Noel's permission to name his latest hybrid lupin after Kathleen and name it not Mrs. Kathleen Terry, but Mrs. Noel Terry. Noel happily agreed. Whilst reading the catalogue later that or the following year, he commented on how she had gone up in price. Kathleen's quizzical reaction made him realise that he had never told her of his agreement to her having a lupin named after her. However, it did make it to the display one year at Chelsea, but sadly is no longer available in their catalogue. While entertaining was not a feature of life in the house, family gatherings, Christmas events, Betty's wedding breakfast in the garden, and regular visits by very small numbers of special and long-term friends all happened. Kathleen was a keen gardener and animal lover. The garden was home to a wide range of animals: dogs, cats, goldfish, green lizards, bell toads, and terrapins. However, to Betty's dismay, not to her pony, which had to stay at the stables further up the Tadcaster Road. Noel was clearly devoted to his family and certainly in their younger years joined in with family rituals and family fun. He was very particular about the use of grammar and would frequently remind those he was in conversation with if he thought they had used it incorrectly. This showed most humorously and significantly in his very special relationship with Daphne Creer, the daughter of close friends, and who it is thought might well have been Kenneth's fiancée had Kenneth lived. Noel and Daphne shared an enthusiasm of what became known as ditties in the family. Here is a sample of one written by Noel in 1951, entitled Psalm 1952, which might give us some insight to another side of his thoughts. The government is my shepherd. I need not work. It alloweth me to lie down on a good job. It leadeth me beside still factories. It destroyeth my initiative. It leadeth me in the path of a parasite for politics' sake. Yea, though I walk through the valley of laziness and deficit spending, I will fear no evil, for the government is with me. Its doles and its vote-getters comfort me. It prepareth an economic utopia for me, by appropriating the earnings of mine own grandchildren. It filleth my head with false security. Thy inefficiency runneth over. Surely the government shall care for me all the days of my life, and I shall dwell in a fool's paradise forever. And in case you have any doubt about authenticity here is Noel's handwritten copy. Perhaps this was Noel's take on Attlee's post-war government's effort to increase the role of the state. Betty reminds us that he occupied the traditional male role of being in charge, as was normal for that period. He had his limits and exercised mild forms of discipline at home. On Saturday mornings, the tradition had been established that each child would answer a tricky question in order to receive their pocket money. Failure to answer correctly actually did mean no pocket money. Individual visits to his study at school report time resulted in either a veiled congratulation or, at worst, a raspberry. Betty's words, not mine. Life moved on. Betty married and moved to southern England. Kenneth became an RAF pilot and was tragically killed. Peter went off to university, and Richard spent several years in India before returning to Yorkshire, to agricultural college, and then to become a farmer. So Goddard's became a very quiet place. Noel cherished his collection of clocks, which needed regular winding and regulating, and they soon took over what had been the children's playroom, renamed the Clock Room. His Georgian furniture, which filled the house and attics, was very important to him, and he continued to add to it. We must assume that although he lived in what we now regard as an iconic arts and crafts designed house, which he had commissioned, that arts and crafts furniture did not appeal, as there is no awareness of him commissioning or purchasing any arts and crafts pieces. Perhaps that might have been different had Walter Brierley, his friend and neighbour, not died as the roof of Goddard's went on. This is thought to have been a favourite piece acquired in 1947, now on display at Fairfax House, along with his other furniture and clocks. Noel's friend, the late Darrell Buttery, told me of his own visits to Noel at Goddard's and those made by members of the Georgian Society to the house to view the furniture and clocks. At some point, John Betjeman also made a visit. Noel and Kathleen continued with quiet routines of meeting with a small number of friends. Noel continued to play golf and attend meetings of his societies, sometimes with Kathleen. Family members visited, but by all accounts, Goddard's was always a quiet house, and neither Noel or Kathleen encouraged parties or many social activities. So let us now just look at Noel in his role at Terry's. Noel ceased working for the bank he had joined after leaving school and began work in the company in 1911, joining the board later that year, aged 22. He became the managing director and chairman of Terry's in 1958 and remained in that position until his retirement in 1970, when he was 80 years old. Before we look at his time in charge, it might be useful to be aware of some background family issues and make mention of the structure of the Terry family lines insofar as they relate to Noel. Family trees can be quite difficult in these settings, partly because they're often small, so this is a rather simplified version, which I hope serves the purpose for tonight. The first, Sir Joseph Terry, identified by the red arrow, married twice. His first marriage was to Frances Goddard, which is the top green arrow on the left, and that produced 3 sons, Thomas Walker Leaper Terry, who was the future father of Noel Terry, Joseph Richard Terry and Samuel Saville. Then his second marriage was to Margaret Thorpe, identified by the blue arrow on the right-hand side. And that took place in 1871, 4 years after the death of his first wife, who became Lady Terry and produced 3 daughters and 1 son. You will have noticed that Sir Joseph's first wife was called Goddard. Hence today we know Noel as Noel Goddard Terry, and his family home on the Tadcaster Road as Goddards. Noel's motive for continuing the name Goddard can only be imagined, as again we can find nothing written. But he might have wished his own grandmother to be remembered, particularly in the light of subsequent family disharmony. Due to financial problems in the Terry family at this time, to do with death duties and other issues, Noel left Marlborough School earlier than usual and did not attend university. Instead, he returned to Trentham, his home on the Mount in York. And to make matters worse, his father, Thomas, was killed in a road traffic accident in July 1910 when Noel was just 20. This cutting states, in July 1910, Thomas W.L. Terry was cycling on his new bike down Windmill Lane towards Tadcaster Road in York. A Mr. Forth came round the corner and Thomas ran straight into him. A shaft from the bicycle pierced his right thigh, blood poisoning set in, and he died from sepsis. There were tensions in the Terry family between Sir Joseph's first family, which included Noel's father Thomas, and his second wife, who is portrayed as a rather forceful and ambitious lady, and her family, which included her son, Frank, to whom history seems to tell us she gave priority. When Sir Joseph Terry died in 1898, Lady Terry was appointed governing director by the will of her husband, and had transferred to her the majority of the shares in the company. Unusually for the period, Lady Terry joined the board and used her title and shares to influence the business. She tended to give priority to her own family over that of her husband's former wife. As Noel's father was a son of Sir Joseph's first wife, Frances Goddard, this meant that it proved difficult for Noel to be accepted into the company. Noel's father contested the appointment of Lady Terry and questioned her control over the board, but she maintained her grip and championed her own son Frank, moving into managing the business. So Noel worked for the Midland Bank in Middlesbrough until 1911, when he did eventually join the firm. He started at the very bottom, working on inventories, and showed his frustration in one of his letters to Kathleen, describing how he had been made responsible for counting the napkins, the cutlery in the restaurant, stating, "They'll be asking me to count the tacks in the carpet next." He then worked in the St Helens Square shop before travelling the country, meeting retailers and others the Terry Company relied on for their support. An alarming or amusing comment, depending on your point of view, in one of Noel's letters in May 1914 to Kathleen, following a visit to some retailers in the northeast at this time, read, "One of them must spend quite as much time tasting various brands of whiskey as he does sweets. Incidentally, he introduced us to his boiling shop. What a place. If the public only knew what they were eating. The next man gave me a lecture about the way Terry's had stood still, as though I don't know all about that." This hints at what we now know was a worrying situation, and the one that was at the root of Kathleen's father's reluctance for his daughter to marry into the Terry family. The company was, as Betty describes in her book Secret Letters, at a low ebb, a view echoed by Noel, as we shall see later. In about 1911, the directors agreed that Noel could become a director in the place of his mother, who had been the recipient of her husband, that's Noel's father's, shares at his death. Hence, Noel became joint managing director with Frank from Lady Terry's side of the family before the First World War, then full chairman and managing director in 1958 on Frank's retirement. Noel's introduction to the company gave him a solid grounding, and his period in management included the very successful 1920s and 30s, when Terry's were employing over 2,000 people. The company was highly regarded and providing almost exclusively for the middle and upper classes, as determined by their price ranges. His management career was, of course, disrupted by the war. Ernest Leatham was a man of great determination, wealth, ambition, and some force. The second letters describe long and only partially explained reasons for Ernest Leatham's behaviour towards members of the Terry family and his attempts to take control of the firm. By 1915, he had invested a considerable amount of money in the company. This and the war offered him at last the opportunity to be in control, and so in 1915 he became the first non-Terry family member to become chairman. As Noel was at war, it is likely that Ernest played an important role in buying the land, commissioning and planning the Bishopthorpe factory. More research on this is needed, but the factory was certainly needed urgently, as the existing factory at Clementhorpe was inadequate. It flooded from time to time and was not equipped to deal with the growth in chocolate production. At a later point, Noel Terry was quoted as saying, "Ernest Leatham was the third son, Sidney was his brother, and they were very big in Leatham Millers of York. Ernest was also a member of the Merchant Adventurers and chairman of Terry's for a number of years. I would say our firm in those days was rather going through the doldrums, and when he came into it, he added great life to the place, and his connection is one I have never ceased to be thankful for." I would suggest, on my own deduction really, I would suggest that this is a rather good-natured statement said in hindsight, as Ernest's involvement in the firm and with Noel's family was, to say the least, controversial, divisive, and difficult for Noel in his youth, although things did improve over the years. Noel's return to the firm after the war is not documented, but we have to imagine that he continued his preparation for senior management and took the lead in the plans to make Bishopthorpe operational. He appears to have taken particular responsibility for sales and administration. As his responsibility increased, he undoubtedly saw his role as being to preserve the quality of Terry products in the style of his grandfather, Sir Joseph. One way was to decide, with his step-uncle and joint managing director Frank, to buy cocoa plantations in Venezuela. Noel was adamant that the quality of Terry's chocolate and its delicate flavour, which differed from the other major brands, was due to the use of the Criolla bean, which came from South America. In 1926, the plantations which had been supplying Terry's with their cocoa beans were for sale, so he and Frank travelled to Caracas in order to secure the supply of the treasured bean. This showed immense courage and single-minded determination at a time when the company had just made a huge investment in the new Bishopthorpe factory, so the financial risk must have been very high, and Goddard's was just being completed too. The plantations are worthy of a session in their own right, and much more research is needed on them. But here are just a few details which give some idea of the huge undertaking which was started. These are just some very brief details, really. It was outside Caracas, where the black arrow is on the right-hand side. The red arrow is where the boat that they had to buy in England and transport out was transported to. So the plantations were approximately 133 acres in very mountainous regions. Water rights were immensely complicated, and the files on water rights at the Borthwick Institute are almost thicker than the plantation files. A boat called the Sea Lark was purchased and renovated in Shoreham by Sea and sent out to help workers. And we've searched, or I've searched, and other people have too, everywhere to find a photograph of the Sea Lark, but unfortunately there is no photograph still in existence. So a map of 1926 indicates that there were almost 40,000 trees, and a map of 1945 indicates 66,500. But in each case, only about a third are non-productive. So in order to deal with this responsibility and the fragility of these beans, Noel appointed a botanist, a York-based botanist called Ernest Chambers, and this is a photograph of him. And Noel was employed to oversee the necessary replanting and supervision of the crops. I'm hoping that Noel's granddaughter has been able to be with us this evening, because she has been really helpful and has been very kind in allowing us to use this photograph of her grandfather and of his wonderful drawings of cocoa pods. As a Justice of the Peace, Noel had to oversee and sign much of the correspondence and administration to get Ernest in and out of Venezuela. Noel and Kathleen are known to have visited the plantations in January 1930, returning in April. This is a photograph of one of the trees on the plantation where the pods can be seen growing directly out of the bark by the red arrows. It's not a very clear photograph because of the texture. The photo on the right is one of Ernest's many skilled drawings showing this more clearly. So what did Noel achieve during his time in the company? He was joint managing director with Frank Terry from 1923 and chairman from 1960, and oversaw many major developments during the busy 20s and 30s and later. Here are just a few of them. The launch of the chocolate apple in 1924. According to his daughter Betty, it is highly likely that the chocolate apple was the result of Noel's love of apples. Meals would often end with Noel peeling an apple, removing the skin in a one-piece spiral, and dividing the fruit into slices to share around the table. The transference of this idea to chocolate, not flavoured apple, just milk chocolate, was a very good move, and the chocolate apple remained in production for 30 years until 1954. Sorry, I forgot to show it to you. That's the original packaging, and we've had permission from the York Museums Trust to show that, which is in their possession. He oversaw the opening and organisation of the 5-storey chocolate factory and administration building at Bishopthorpe, which was opened in 1926, the very same year he bought the plantations and was preparing to move into newly built Goddards. So the 20s and 30s were exceedingly busy. Then there was the purchase of the plantations in 1926, sold in 1946 following the war. He was responsible for overseeing the development of many assortments and new products which were introduced, and many survived for a long number of years. Old gold is still familiar to us, although certainly not made in York, probably made in Sweden. The New York assortment, New World assortment, the 1967 assortment, Spartan, and dozens and dozens and dozens of other ranges. In 1932, we saw the launch of the chocolate orange, and this too is the original packaging, and as we all know, it is still widely available, much smaller in size, and some would claim not tasting nearly as good. In 1937, the visit to the factory by King George VI and Queen Elizabeth, followed by a number of other developments as seen here. By 1937, there were approximately 2,500 employees. In 1939, the factory was used for war purposes, whilst limited manufacturing did continue. And in 1950, exports were approximately 12 million. They also continued to feature within the confectionery industry in terms of exhibitions and other events, and there was the emergence of alcohol in commercial assortments such as liqueurs. Oral history interviews with employees show the company was well regarded, a fair employer, and for some even preferred to that other major York-based chocolate company, and one which looked after its employees through a variety of factory, social benefits, societies, etc. However, sadly, unlike Rowntree's, there was never a company journal such as the Cocoa Works magazine, so the detail of life in the factory and the lives of the people working there has been lost. Several generations of families worked there at the same time, and even today there is much affection for the company and the family, as we have experienced through visitors' comments whilst visiting Goddard's Gardens. Noel's style of management is difficult to determine, as he appears to have operated mainly at a distance. Few, if any, of the many people we interviewed, I'm losing track of time. Few, if any, of the many people we interviewed as part of the oral history project knew or had met him. He was not in favour of advertising, believing instead that word of mouth was sufficient, nor did he appear to anticipate the changes that would inevitably take place after the war. Terry's had always concentrated on high-quality, luxurious ranges of confectionery, but the market for these products was much reduced after the war. Whilst he is on tape as saying that he had enormous respect for the Rowntrees, he is also known to have said, "Rowntree is quantity, Terry is quality." The 50s and early 60s were very difficult years for the Terrys because manufacturing had been greatly reduced during the war years and the company had to rely on large contracts from chain stores. It is possible that Noel's commitment to expensive cocoa beans from South America, which yielded only about half of the number of cocoa beans that all the other chocolate manufacturers were getting from their harvests. It's possible that his commitment to these expensive beans, combined with a very low level of advertising and perhaps a lack of future planning for new and lower-priced products, along with other changes in the confectionery market, all took their toll. In 1963, as a result of share activity and other financial pressures, Charles Forte became the major shareholder, so the company was no longer majority owned by the Terry family. However, under Charles Forte's ownership, Noel remained as chairman for another 7 years until 1970, when he was 80 and he retired after 59 years with the company. Noel's civic life in York Noel was extremely fond of York. He had been born in the city and took a deep interest in it. He was proud of the roles of his ancestors in the city. And this included John Terry, a clockmaker in the early 1700s, whose one-handed clock is still working with the help of the York Clock Group in the pediment over the Castle Museum. There was also Joseph Alfred Terry, an artist, an established artist, and Noel's own grandfather had been Lord Mayor of York 4 times and was knighted in 1887. Noel did not have a political career as he felt his priority at the time needed to be the company. He wanted both his own life and the activity of the company to enhance York and make a contribution to the quality of life in the city. Noel was not a disruptor, a revolutionary, or a person who wanted to cultivate a public image. His contribution always appears to have been to support the status quo and to have had fairly humble motives. After all, in one of his letters to Kathleen, in 1912, he wrote, "If we have anything like my imagination, then, indeed, beloved, I have a great and glorious future. Unlike some people, I don't aspire to fame, riches, rank and power. No, dearie, I aspire far beyond that. I aspire a home." Here are just some of his activities in both his private York life and commercial life. I don't have time to go through this list in detail, but we just highlight a few of them. And it doesn't mean that the ones I don't highlight are less important. It's just a time pressure. It is worth mentioning his role in the Merchant Adventurers. Are you okay? Can you hear me? I'm getting funny signs. Right, okay. His role in the Merchant Adventurers was very significant. He was the governor in 1935 and 6 and 36 and 7, and he was their honorary treasurer for 25 years. He made a number of very generous gifts to the organisation. The top left one shows people holding this wooden stave, which he donated. The walnut armchair was gifted in 1964, and then a silver tankard in 1964, and a set of 10 walnut chairs and a table gifted in 1946, for which I can't use the photograph. So that was really his very significant contribution. He was chairman of York Boys Club for many years. He was a Justice of the Peace for the West Riding in 1933, director of York a dispensary in 1939, governor of Askenbrine Women's Prison. He was a member of the Georgian Society in York since its foundation, elected vice president in 1967, and a very serious collector of Georgian furniture, clocks, porcelain and art. He was president of the Confectioners' Benevolent Society and a benefactor of York Minster, St. Peter's School governor, and he founded the Noel Terry Charitable Trust in the 60s, which is still working today and supporting a number of local causes and is chaired by a member of the Terry family. So, who was Noel Terry in the light of life's events, and what are his legacies? We are all, to some extent, a product of our history. The degree to which we are able to take control to compensate for our disadvantages or disruptions varies according to our personality and other factors. Few of us remain the same throughout our lives. Life had not always been kind to Noel, resulting perhaps in different dimensions of his personality coming through at different times. He was dutiful and showed great inner strength and resolve by coping with many personal, family, professional and health crises, while still leading a busy life as a director, benefactor, friend and collaborator. But here is a summary of what seemed to me to be the possible influences which may have caused him to become more introspective, guarded, perhaps controlling, as the years wore on, and while he continued with his responsibilities. They are not in any particular order of significance. He had to leave Marlborough early as funds were limited. Both his brothers had attended university, but university was not an option for him. The death of his father by the age of 20, precipitating very difficult issues in relation to the company and the role of his branch of the family in it. Serious injuries in World War I, along with the loss of his best man, who had also been his best friend, and other friends too. The death of his father-in-law, Ernest Leatham, in 1923, under tragic circumstances, with the ensuing need for him to support his wife through a very traumatic period. The death of his son, Kenneth, in World War II, aged 24, which had a devastating effect on him and on the whole family. Kenneth was named after his best friend and best man, who was also killed. The responsibilities of his own role in World War II in being the commanding officer of the Observer Corps. The death of his brother Neville, who was only 1 year older than him, in 1934. Evidence shows that Neville had some unhappiness in his life, which I can only imagine would have had an effect on Noel. Many serious health issues later in life which seemed to affect his confidence and quality of life. He was seriously ill in 1960 and had subsequent eye and stomach operations. Several relatives I spoke to felt that health issues possibly accounted for the greatest change in his personality in later years. Addressing the commercial problems of the company after rationing ended, although still a prestigious company, Terry's had to a large extent lost its place as one of the principal providers of luxury chocolate and confectionery. It struggled in the 1950s to the point where Noel was the person who oversaw the takeover of the family firm to Charles Forte. There are varying views by those who knew him well as to the effect this had on Noel, but it seems that he made no open display of his feelings. However, it is very hard to imagine that this change did not affect him deeply. Being the last member of the originating family of such a large and well-known company, seeing it being taken over by outsiders must have been really upsetting. No one I spoke to had seemed to have any detailed or deep conversations with him about this. Did he bear it alone? The consequences of this. Later in his life, Noel began to come across to many as a very different person to the romantic, horse riding, tennis playing, punting, skating, humorous, communicative and spirited young person of the early 1900s. To many at the company and to some family members, he was perceived as having become self-contained, distant, reserved, formal and even invisible. Although considered very kindly and known to have a well-hidden sense of humour to those who got close. Home life has been described by those who knew it and who I have spoken to as rather structured, disciplined, quiet, and dominated by his needs. He had rather strong views on the role of women, particularly in the company, where it was said many times to me that they would not have had a role on the board. Could this have been influenced by his experience of Lady Terry taking a dominant role in the company after her husband's death, which excluded him for some years? His own daughter Betty tells in her memoir that she was left in no doubt that once married, her side of the family, with a name other than Terry, would be of less interest than his son's. In the manner of the time, he had a stiff upper lip approach, either unwilling or unable to express feelings which in earlier years he seemed to be able to share much more easily, at least with family members, as the letters show. It is not known if he shared his feelings with anyone. Was this because of a strong sense of self-reliance, an inability to share? Perhaps he felt it might seem like weakness. Was it loneliness? Or because he simply didn't need to? But always in the end, his affection and devotion to his family was unquestionable, even if not demonstratively obvious. One relative told me that after his wife's death, he said to her that he now knew how important his family had been to him. According to this relative, this was not something that he had been heard to say before, which doesn't mean that he didn't think it, but some might say it wasn't always obvious. From day one, he always knew how important Kathleen was to him and showed it in his own way. And one of these was that on her birthday, he always picked a rose from the rose garden and placed it on her breakfast table. The legacies, and you may be pleased to know, to sum up, he left us all many legacies. To the city he loved, he was a discreet and generous benefactor to many institutions and organisations, and he gave his time quietly to many, many causes. The factory building, built in his name, although now used for different purposes, has conservation status, and the clock tower continues to be a landmark for the city. His furniture and clock collection was deemed by Christie's after his death to be one of the most important of its kind in the country, and is displayed together at Fairfax House for all to see. The Civic Trust and the Georgian Society, both of which he helped to create, are still thriving, and the Noel Terry Charitable Trust is still supporting many important causes in York. Concerning his and Kathleen's letters, his daughter has expressed a view that, quote, "It would almost appear that Noel and Kathleen intended their story to be told, as so many of their letters survive." The letters represent a very personal record of many events of the period which have an historical significance, as well as of their own deep and enduring love. Given the decline by most of us in actually writing letters which will be kept, the survival of this correspondence in itself is a legacy of how people used to live and communicate. Noel had hoped that his furniture and clock collection could be on display together at Goddard's. However, after being open for many years and welcoming well over 20,000 visitors each year, the family rooms of his important house are empty and not currently open to the public. This is a sad loss to an aspect of York's history because it contains important architectural features and is the last house designed by Walter Brierley. It has significant and local family associations and is now the only relatively unaltered domestic house and vital link to the chocolate and confectionery history of the city. The gardens are open on Sundays each week from March to October and are being very well cared for. Finally, if we look at this as a sort of jigsaw, together the factory estate with its buildings subject to conservation status, the Goddard's estate, with its very important house designed by a nationally significant arts and crafts architect, now also with conservation status, but closed and with the family rooms unused, and a noted arts and crafts garden designed by a renowned garden designer of the period who had worked with Lutyens, and the family representing the story of one local family dating back to the mid-1700s. and as a one-time major employer of thousands of local people, which made a nationally known brand of chocolate and confectionery, creating part of the history of chocolate and confectionery making in York. All these pieces of the jigsaw are, it seems to me, very interdependent. The family history, the industrial and employment history, the domestic home architecture and garden design, and the apothecary, confectionery and chocolate history. We are fortunate to have an important and interrelated collection of aspects of York history originating from one family. If any one of these aspects is lost or diminished, it seems unlikely we will ever see it return. All these pieces need to be actively protected as part of the bigger picture, and I hope that the people of York and York authorities will make the effort to ensure that this happens. It is all part of Noel's legacy. Now it is York's history. Terry's in all these guises is still remembered fondly today. Noel Terry, MBE, died on the 25th of May 1980, and his obituary appeared in the Times on the 4th of June 1980. Thank you very much, and I'm sorry if I've gone very over time.